Their headline was, "Scientists say smelling farts might prevent cancer." I'm going to tell you right now that this is patently untrue, so untrue that Time embarrassingly had to issue a complete retraction of this article, rewrite it, and republish it under a very different headline: "A stinky compound may protect against cell damage, study finds." Totally different gist here. So what I want to do with the remainder of my talk is just give you a few pieces of advice to kind of navigate the science information that you're likely being hit with on a daily basis.
So today, I'm really excited to host Katie Wu, who is a biology PhD candidate in the laboratory of Dr. Eric Rubin at Harvard University, where she studies how bacteria deal with stress so that she can one day learn to do the same. She obtained her bachelor's and master's at Stanford University, where she studied biology and creative writing. For the past 2 years, she has served as co-director of Science in the News, a graduate student organization dedicated to making cutting-edge science accessible to the general public and training student scientists to better communicate their work. Additionally, she directs curriculum for the Health Professions Recruitment and Exposure Program at Harvard, a health sciences and mentorship program for high school students from underserved and underrepresented backgrounds in the Boston area. In her spare time, she says she serves as a heat-generating pillow for her cats. So basically, the way this event will sort of run, Katie will go through a presentation. Today's topic will be about the era of fake news and alternative facts and how that is putting science communication in a pretty precarious position.
All right. So hi, everyone. Welcome again. Ralph just gave me a really nice intro, so I don't really have to introduce myself, but I'll probably do it anyway. So I'm Katie. I'm a PhD student at Harvard. I'm also one of the directors of Science in the News. We train graduate students to better communicate their science to the general public, because this is something that I think is really important, and hopefully you do too, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Basically what I'm here to talk to you about tonight is a big problem I think our country is having right now regarding science communication, or rather the lack thereof. And the way I want to start this off is actually by telling you a little bit about my mom. Because my mom, when I was growing up, was actually really into learning and fostering a positive learning environment in our home. She always had the news on in the background while we were eating dinner. She read the paper every morning. Whenever we drove anywhere, she always had the radio on, tuned to the local news station. And this was great. I think this really fostered my own love of learning and made me want to stay in school and not do drugs. But this kind of all fell apart a couple years ago when my cousin, in an act of revenge, helped my mom make her own Facebook. And that's pretty much when my mom started sending me emails full of articles with headlines like this: "Bras shown to cause cancer." And before I continue, I just want to assure everyone in the room that this article was not written on the basis of scientific facts, so please, ladies and gentlemen, keep your bras on. There have actually been no clinical studies linking bra wearing to the development of cancer. But my mom saw this and took it at face value, enough so that she thought it was important enough to send to me. And that's not something that makes my mom stupid or ignorant or even naive, because why shouldn't she believe a piece of science news? And this is the big problem right now, because there's a lot of trash out there that's hitting us in our Facebook news feeds, on Reddit, even in fairly reputable publications that we depend on for a lot of our news. And it's not that science has gotten any trashier in recent years, it's that there's a lot of trash out there masquerading as science. And what I want to talk to you about today is the fact that the consequences of this go far beyond a potential dip in sales at Victoria's Secret. And I think some really good examples of this are pretty apparent. One big one is still ongoing, actually, the issue of lead poisoning coming from the water sources in Flint, Michigan. In 2014, Flint switched water supplies, and it turned out that lead started leaching into the water supply and poisoning the residents of Flint. And despite the fact that scientists tuned into this pretty quickly, they knew actually right off the bat that there was a big link between what water these people were drinking and the symptoms of lead poisoning that were presenting in local hospitals. It actually took the city over 3 years to stop insisting that the water was safe to drink. Similarly, in the 1950s, after the Surgeon General linked smoking to lung cancer, the tobacco industry spent millions of dollars hiring their own corrupt scientists to disseminate the information that not only were cigarettes not giving people lung cancer, but they could actually be really good for lung health. Nowadays, we have issues surrounding vaccines and their potential link to autism. Not true, but that's a conversation for later. This is all based on a single guy named Andrew Wakefield publishing a study in The Lancet that he eventually had to retract because people got him to admit that he falsified all the data in that study. And of course, one of my personal favorites, climate change. Even though 98% of scientists agree that that climate change is a very real and urgent issue nowadays, the fact that the science surrounding this has not been communicated effectively means that a lot of people in this nation still believe it's a hoax and don't want to do anything about it. And I could go on and on with the list of science misrepresentations in today's world, but what I hope I'm getting across to you is the fact that science has had a pretty shoddy history of being transparent with the general public. And this has put us in a pretty dangerous situation because it's not just about the lack of information out there, but the fact that misrepresentation of science can really negatively affect our behavior, our health, and the future of our entire country. And that's a huge issue. So, I mean, what is actually going to be done about this? Because this stands to me as something that is really upsetting. I was always taught to believe that science was about two things: acquiring knowledge and then disseminating that knowledge, because why on earth are we making discoveries if we can't share them in an understandable way with the rest of the world? Based on the fact that so many of these issues make science muddied up with lack of presentation, misrepresentation, or just things getting entangled with politics, means that science is getting a worse and worse reputation. So what I hope you can help me answer tonight is, what can we do to mend this rift between scientists and the general public? So this is certainly not a new thought. I'm not the first person to be talking about science communication and the rift between scientists and the general public. But the way that people have traditionally approached this is something that I'm going to argue is maybe the wrong way. And I'm actually going to demo this, because what's a science talk without a demo? The traditional view of this gap that exists between scientists and the general public, I'm going to model here for you with these two beakers in front of me. A lot of scientists have previously been under the impression that it's really just about the amount of information that's out there in the world. So scientists, the general public. Clearly, there's more water in this beaker. And so it's all about the lack of information that we're sending out to the general public. If we just put more information out there, problem solved. It's all gonna be okay, everyone's gonna be on the same page. But here's the problem: scientists are publishing as much as ever, the information is technically going out into the world, and yet this rift still exists. And I think what the problem is scientists are not actually thinking about the way in which they're putting the information out there and the context into which they're putting that information. So I can add liquid to this beaker to increase the amount of volume, but if I don't do it the right way, I'm actually putting information out there that is less clear than it should be. And so what I think is, scientists are not thinking about the quality of the information they're putting out there. They're instead focusing on quantity. But even though the level of water in here is rising, it's not making anything more clear. And I can keep adding to this beaker, but simply putting more information out there is not going to make the solution any more clear. So what I think needs to happen is we need to change the way we approach this and change the quality of the information we put out there in the hopes of clarifying waters that have already been muddied. What I just showed you is what a lot of science communicators have started to call the deficit model. It's about what information is and isn't out there. It's about quantity rather than quality. What I'm going to propose instead is this idea behind cultural cognition, which I'm actually not going to get to, except because I put in a couple slides before that. So the second issue that I actually want to talk about really quickly before I get to cultural cognition is the second issue with the deficit model. What I showed you at the very beginning of this was two beakers, one of which was much more full than the other. I think the base assumption of this model is actually wrong. This assumes that scientists have more information, the general public has less. And that is not an absolute statement. What I would actually like to say is that the common misconception that scientists live apart from the general public and that these two groups are two separate entities is actually false. I wasn't born a scientist. I wasn't born armed with a wealth of information that is completely unattainable. I would argue that I was born within the general public, and even that I never really left it, because even though I went on to pursue a degree and acquire a lot of information, this didn't make me better than anyone else. My degree is not going to make me magical. It is not going to separate me from anyone else in society. Because here's the thing, I don't think scientists and the general public are two different mutually exclusive groups of people. If you ask me a question about art history or advanced calculus or parenting or jiu-jitsu, I'm going to be as much a member of the general public as someone might be when we face off in microbiology, for instance. I think if we stop seeing these two groups of people as mutually exclusive, that barrier can come down, because part of making the rift between scientists and the general public disappear is acknowledging that, in a way, there isn't really a rift at all. And so now, this is the idea behind the cultural cognition model. So the cultural cognition model is in stark contrast with the deficit model, because this is an idea that's been championed by someone at Yale University named Dan Kahan. It's the idea that when we acquire information from the world around us, we're not doing it as blank slates. We all acquire information and try and fit it into our pre-existing world model. So even if somebody throws a ton of stuff at us, we're going to subconsciously hear the things that already reinforce our values, our beliefs, and the things that fit into what we understand of the world. And there's nothing wrong with this. We all do it. It's totally fine. And so understanding this means understanding that simply putting information out there is not going to be enough. We have to address how we put information out there in a way that respects and acknowledges people's values. So I think there are two ways that are going to be really crucial to achieving this. So if we know that cultural cognition is an issue, first of all, what we should be doing is, when we have conversations with people with whom we might disagree, instead of just telling them that they're wrong, we should actually ask them why they believe what they believe. If we simply tell them that they're wrong, what people often perceive is not only that you're questioning their knowledge base, but that you're questioning their core values. And from that point on, they're basically going to shut you out. So I'm actually going to use climate change as an example. So studies have shown that a lot of people who oppose climate change are very capitalistically driven, and they think that climate change is a hoax made up by people who really want to put a stopper on the industries of heavy commerce and industry. Basically, they want to put a cap on individual human potential. So if I were to ask someone why they doubt climate change and they were to tell me that it's all kind of an industrial myth, I would say, okay, that's actually a very fair thing to value. We should be worried about human industrialization. We should be worried about maintaining the commerce that makes the world go round. Maybe consider the fact that combating climate change is actually going to open up jobs in spheres that will still maximize that potential, in geophysics and nuclear power. The second thing that we can do, if we're to listen to this idea of cultural cognition, is simply to make the faces of science a little more diverse. Unfortunately, science is still dominated by white men. We need more women, more minorities, more languages that science can be spoken in. I think as scientists, we need to set a good example and show the world that science can present a diverse front and that scientific consensus includes people from all walks of life. So I've just painted a somewhat bleak picture because I can tell you right now that these things are not happening everywhere, but I don't want you to despair. There is hope. There are a lot of organizations out there trying to rectify this and are listening to the values of cultural cognition in an attempt to change the way we actually communicate science. So I want to talk to you about a few of the ways that we as individuals can navigate the scientific milieu that's out there in the world today. So this is a very alarming graphic, and I just want to take a second to step you through it. So luckily for me, someone did all the hard work for me. So this graph is from the American Council of Science and Health and Real Clear Science. What they did was they surveyed a bunch of popular outlets that regularly produce science news and qualitatively rated them on two metrics. The first is how evidence-driven their articles are, and the second is how readable the articles are, both of which are incredibly important in effectively communicating science. You could even say that one of these follows the deficit model and the other follows cultural cognition. And what I want to point out here is this top left box with New Scientist, Ars Technica, and The Economist is what they're kind of calling the gold standard of scientific communication. These are great publications, and I highly encourage you to check them out if you haven't already. Something I do want to point out here is the fact that there are actually two very reputable science journals in here, Nature and Science. They typically publish primary research papers full of scientific jargon, but what a lot of people don't know is on their websites, they also write science news articles intended for a general public audience, and they're really excellently written. But of course, this graph was not made by me, and it's imperfect. Part of this compilation was absolutely subjective, so I do have a few qualifications I want to put onto here. These that I've circled in purple are a few publications that I think deserve a little more credit than have been given on here, especially the New York Times, 538, and Wired. It's very sad to me that they consider 538 basically unreadable. I especially want to highlight NPR because in addition to producing really good radio segments and writing awesome science articles on their website, they've also started this initiative called Joe's Big Idea, which is seeking to humanize scientists in the public eye by interviewing scientists across the country, asking them about their lives, and telling people, hey, these people also like dogs and have allergies. They're just like you. Another thing about Joe's Big Idea is they're starting to bring together young scientists from across the country in small groups to help each other communicate science better. And they've personally benefited me, so I really have to give them credit here. On the flip side of this, I think there are a few publications on here that maybe are getting a little too much credit. I do really like The Atlantic, and The Guardian is fine a lot of the time, but The Atlantic is just as subject to a lot of the sensationalization that lost a lot of these other publications' points on here. And to be quite honest with you, I think any credit given to Fox News is too much credit. And finally, I want to add a couple things on here, especially for Boston Locals. Stat, which is a subsidiary of the Boston Globe, publishes excellent science news articles that I think are incredibly accurate and readable. Cell is another science journal that does a great job of blogging about science in a very readable way. And AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is doing a similar thing. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention NOVA in giant letters up here, and they only paid me $12 to say that. And with no ulterior motives whatsoever, I'm also gonna bring up Bill Nye because he's one of the most important science communication figures that we've seen in our history. And if you go back to the cafe tonight, they have a bow tie pasta salad, which I think is the coolest thing in the world. Finally, I'm going to put my own organization up here because I can. Science in the News is working really hard to bring science directly from scientists to the general public. Okay, but I think that's all well and good, but I am by no means telling you to restrict all your science reading to the publications in that top left box there. That's not possible, because if your mom happens to know someone with a parrot who was once pooped on someone who goes on Facebook sometimes, you're very likely being slammed with all kinds of information 24/7, and it's not always the easiest thing to tell what is good and what is bad information, especially when you're seeing headlines like this or headlines like this, both of which are completely untrue, and my personal favorite from Fox News, this. So what I want to do with the remainder of my talk is just give you a few pieces of advice to kind of navigate the science information that you're likely being hit with on a daily basis. My first piece of advice is read onwards. Don't just take that headline at face value, especially if you're planning to communicate this information to someone else. Do yourself a favor, click on the article, read it, spend some time figuring out if it's actually worth remembering that information. And all that takes, in a lot of cases, is scrolling down. And so that's a big ask. How can we actually evaluate whether an article is giving us good information or not? To think about this, I want to go back to this very pungent example. Study says smelling farts can be good for you. A very particular science publication came out, a primary research paper, and within a few days, headlines were flooding the internet, and they all looked like this, and this, and this, and this. Pretty embarrassing stuff. Probably the worst one of all was from Time magazine. Their headline was, "Scientists say smelling farts might prevent cancer." I'm going to tell you right now that this is patently untrue, so untrue that Time embarrassingly had to issue a complete retraction of this article, rewrite it, and republish it under a very different headline: "A stinky compound may protect against cell damage, study finds." Totally different gist here. They also had to republish this with the embarrassing disclaimer, "Correction appended July 14th, and that correction read an earlier version of this article and correctly summarized the findings and implications of the study." No kidding. So let's dig a little deeper into what this scientific study was actually looking at, because I'm sure you're all curious about what farts have to do with cancer. So the actual study, the second headline up here, does basically get it. It's talking about a compound called hydrogen sulfide, which, to be fair, is in farts, and it's what gives farts that awesome odor. It's also the scent that you'll notice in a rotting egg. So it's something that everyone's familiar with. And so hydrogen sulfide is not only found in the body in terms of flatulence, our cells actually produce it in very tiny amounts, and they use them like little pages they send to each other. So a cell can signal to the cell next to it by producing some hydrogen sulfide, and that's actually a way for cells to communicate. Say, "Hey, I know things are stressful right now, but keep doing what you're doing. Don't, run off and die," because cells are often wont to do that. It's basically a molecule that is sometimes able to tell cells, "Calm down, keep calm, and carry on." But what this study in particular did was they were really curious to see what hydrogen sulfide could do to cells grown in a petri dish. Not in a human, not even in a mouse, but just cells in a dish. And so what they did was they put a lot of hydrogen sulfide on these cells, more than they would normally be sending to each other. And it turned out these cells that normally grow and divide and keep dividing and keep dividing like a lot of malignant tumors do, stopped doing that. They stopped acting like cancer cells. And that was really promising. So they thought, hey, maybe someday, way down the road, when we understand this a lot better, this might be something that could have implications for how we think about treating cancer. On the other hand, they fully acknowledged in the study that other studies have shown that cancer cells can actually produce the same hydrogen sulfide that makes them stop growing in smaller amounts to keep growing. So it's really a double-edged sword. It's like the opposite of Goldilocks. Too much can be really good, too little can be really good, but how can we know the context in which one actually works over the other? In no case was a scientist farting on a human patient with cancer and seeing if they were cured. And my big PSA here is that that is never going to be the case. So If we look at some better articles that covered this study well, I want to point out that these studies did a few things. For one, highlighted in red here, they made very clear what the study was doing. They talked about the methods. These were cells grown in petri dishes instead of humans smelling farts in the environment. And the second thing they did was they used real sources. They called scientists, they linked the actual article in the text and said, here's where you can go if you want to learn more about this. And finally, I think the most important thing that they did, these good articles, is they acknowledged the limitations of this science. Because what we try really hard to do is when we publish a study in Science, we try and say at the end of it, so we have this finding, but it is restricted to this population of study subjects with this particular method at this particular point in time in our hands. And these findings can't necessarily be extrapolated to farts and cancer, for instance. So again, I want to really hammer home the message that science is not telling us to go smell farts, but on the other hand, if that's something you really want to do, I am not going to stop you. I think you should do what you love. So, okay, that's kind of my quick primer on how to tell a good science article from a bad. I have a couple more thoughts on how we can generally approach science in our world. So my first one is just keep reading that article. Don't just take the headline at face value. The second is explore the world around you. Don't just limit yourself to written articles. Go to a science lecture, tune into a radio station that covers science, listen to a podcast, download an app that teaches you science. Go to the Boston Museum of Science, which is an awesome science museum. Don't restrict yourself to just one medium. My third piece of advice is to question everything. If your friend tells you that they read this crazy study on how bras cause cancer, ask them where they heard it from and why they believe it. I feel like in our society, we've been trained to think that asking questions makes us sound dumb, but on the contrary, I think asking questions really empowers you. And not only that, but it holds the person dispensing the information to you culpable for that information. And finally, always keep an open mind. This really gets back to cultural cognition, because I know I am wrong all the time. In fact, I would argue that being a scientist is about being proven wrong on a daily basis. And the thing is, not everything we hear is going to fall exactly in line with our current belief system. And not only that, but not everything that is going to turn out to be true is going to fall in line with our current belief system. But that's okay, because I think we are all still learning here. As the general public and scientists, which are really just the same thing, we're all part of the same group, just trying to better understand the world around us. So let's talk about it. And that's all I have. I'm happy to take any questions.
Let's see if I can word this right. There's this, it's a big problem, right? So these news publications are publishing these articles to sell, right? They're not really trying to inform the public, they're trying to sell. And I think that the only way to change the way that's done, or change the kind of the caliber at which they're writing these articles, is through public demand. The public, on the other hand, maybe the majority of the public is not educated enough to know whether what they're reading is high caliber or not. So do you have any ideas of like how to kind of institutionally or like fundamentally change or like set in motion some sort of, you know, big change that would I don't know, it's a big question, but like, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, let me make absolutely sure that I know what you're asking. So you're asking how we can change the way the media traditionally tries to sell science articles and instead motivate through like actually presenting real science?
Yeah, like if not through public demand,
yeah.
How can we keep them accountable for actually promoting real science rather than just trying to sell clicks?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question, and I would argue that that is the fundamental question behind all science communication. Yeah, no, it's a tough one. I mean, I think that that's exactly why media outlets do what they do, because no media outlet is going to be able to sell an article or even get people to click on an article if their headline reads, so scientists have discovered this really tiny part of this really small pathway that is only in flies, but looks like something that might be in humans, and so someday we might be able to think about how this could work in something kind of like cancer. Instead, they're going to say, like, eating fly poop cures cancer. And so that's a huge issue, you know, because journalism has always been about making things snappy, making things readable, and the traditional premise of having a headline was you should be able to get all the information you need from that headline. I think the thing is, like, we need to draw a huge distinction between how we traditionally cover, I think, like, the very clickbaity articles and really separate science from that. And so to get scientific information, people are going to have to learn that they can't rely on outlets that are traditionally going to, like, promote gossip, like things about the media. And what I think will really help with that is familiarizing the general public with the process of science so that people can understand, like, okay, any headline I see that says that, I probably can't believe, because there's no way we can draw that kind of conclusion from a single study in science. And so teaching people that science is a very slow process and, like, it's always changing, the answers are always changing, I'm really hoping will change how people seek out science, so that rather than clicking on those types of articles, they'll actually go elsewhere with maybe a less flashy headline, but a more realistic one. And I realize I didn't answer your question perfectly, but it's, like, a really good question, and yeah.
Hi. So when we were talking about cultural cognition, I think, so you gave a really good example of addressing it in the form of, like, a dialogue with another person, sort of trying to get at why they believe what they believe. Do you have any thoughts on how to address cultural cognition when it's not a dialogue, when you're a person who's writing an article for the general population and you want to reach people who maybe don't have preconceived notions that will make it easy for them to connect with what you're writing?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I think the best example I can give, actually no, scratch that. I think I will answer generally. So I think in any science article, especially something that is presenting a very controversial topic like GMOs or climate change, vaccines and autism, basically that whole list I gave you and more, I think any science article that's worth its salt is going to present both sides of the issue, not because they're divided by opinion, but just because they need to acknowledge that there are people on the other side of this issue. And it's not about them being morally wrong, it's not about calling those people out for their faults, but acknowledging that some people believe this, and they, like, people with beliefs about vaccines and autism, there are websites full of what they believe to be real data linking vaccines to autism. I think it's worth acknowledging that that data exists, but then kind of systematically going through it and explaining why it may not be correct. And then I think also acknowledging that some people may believe this because they have really worthwhile concerns. They're worried about their kids getting sicker, they're worried about, like, social stigma, they're worried about, like, kids having really bad allergic reactions, which is not necessarily related to autism, but there are a lot of people who are anti-vaccination who have a lot of these concerns, and those are worthwhile concerns. They're just kind of manifesting in the wrong way. So I think you almost end up putting both sides of the conversation in a single article.
Hi, I'm a research communications associate at the Museum of Science in Boston, so thank you for the shout out to the museum in your talk. But so I often, as a science communicator, and I also, before I was a science communicator, I was a scientist, and so I get a lot of friends of mine who are looking for resources for where they can find the best information about climate change or different topics that they see in the news. Do you guys at Science in the News have any sort of resources for people where they can see these are the best journals that we think you should look at, you should be reading Nature and things like that, or resources where people can go to find that information? Because I would love to have that, so when people email me asking, I can just be like, there you go.
Yeah, so Actually, I really like the chart I found for this talk. I thought they did a generally very good job, but I will say that as a plug for my own organization, we do write articles on controversial topics. We've published special editions recently on climate change, GMOs, artificial intelligence, neurotechnology, a bunch of these things, and we do our absolute best to link to reputable sources. But what we are working on doing right now is generating a public, readable, and shareable list of reputable science resources that's a little more easily digestible, so not in chart form, but rather just go here, maybe avoid these few, but these are reputable, and these are especially good for instance, like if you want to read about climate change, go here. So it's forthcoming, and I think that is actually, that's absolutely a great resource that I think a lot of places should have.
I actually had a quick question. How do we sort of deal with the fact that because of social media, people are consuming a lot of their science news in either video form or like even smaller sort of bite-sized pieces of content as opposed to like reading articles now? Now it's, you share it on Facebook and you get the headline, and then you get a lot of conversation often in the comments. It's something that we experience a lot on Nova's Facebook page, for example. So given this is sort of the new arena in which people are sort of consuming a lot of their news content, how do you sort of deal with a lot of the issues that you discussed when people are consuming it via social media and not actually even clicking on articles in many cases?
Yeah, that is another great question. I think social media is the ultimate double-edged sword, because when we publish content in so many forms of media, it opens up new venues for people to respond in both positive and negative ways. I have seen people have just the craziest comment wars on a video that I wouldn't even think to be controversial to begin with, that they latch onto something and it becomes chaos. But the power of that comment section is people can also be really productive and say like, hey, read this, and maybe it will shed some light on this, or watch this instead. But I do agree that it's a very different arena, because when you're watching a video or even listening to a podcast, it's very difficult for people to respond. And unfortunately, I think until we come up with a better solution that does not go into censorship and does not just rely entirely on comment wars, we need to sort of, I don't want to say fight fire with fire, but my suggestion would be for scientists to also engage in all forms of media, speak on the radio, get comfortable speaking in public, making videos themselves, making video animations, and make those reliable sources so that eventually those will overwhelm the ones that are spreading misinformation.
Great, thank you. So we actually got a question from somebody in the Newsfeed Cafe. This is a little bit different, but related to climate change. With rising ocean levels due to climate change, why are scientists not working on processing ocean water for drinking water to keep levels down and hydrate the world? Is there any reason, do you know about that?
I am the wrong person
Okay.
to receive this question.
People are working.
I thought, yeah, okay. So what I am getting from my loyal fans is is that this actually is something that is happening in the world, but as you can imagine, purifying ocean water, which is full of not only a bunch of different salts, minerals, organisms, pollutants, because our oceans are indeed very polluted, is a very labor-intensive process. Like even water purification plants that are next to dams that have protected water sources, that's like an incredibly energy inefficient process. And I can only imagine it's worse for ocean water. But I do want to give the full disclaimer that I am not a climate scientist, and I would go elsewhere for the final word on that.
So I was curious about something you mentioned earlier on in your talk, and then I had a more general question based on that. So you mentioned the Wakefield study and vaccines, and I was actually curious. I guess all I'd heard was that he had sort of improperly conducted the study, that he'd like bribed children with cake and all kinds of things like that. But I was curious had it actually gone as far as like he straight up falsified things. And I guess the more general question that I have related to that is, even as someone that's sort of more interested in the scientific process and can appreciate some of those factors and say, oh, wait a second, maybe that throws this into question. It seems the more nuanced, you don't need to get to a lot of levels of nuance before, especially the general public's eyes are going to glaze over and they're just going to be like, okay, they say it's good, they say it's bad. How would you convey the sort of meta science stuff, the philosophy of science type stuff, to where, is there anything that can be done to bridge that gap so the general public could start to get a sense of why that might matter?
Really quickly, I'll answer your first question. So I consider any instance in which a scientist uses kind of sketchy methods, and that's the real scientific term for that, in their study and doesn't fully report it to be basically falsified data. It's unclear at this point because he's also been a little dodgy on like whether or not he completely made up numbers, but I can't trust any piece of that study because, like you said, he used some pretty dubious methods to collect data from his patients, and his reputation has not in the same sense. Your second question, can I ask you to repeat it because I want to make sure I fully understand what you're asking me?
Yeah, so basically if I'm a member of the general public and I'm hearing that, I might be like, okay, well maybe like the math is odd, but like, is this stats nerds complaining about something out in the decimal points? Is this related to like, why does that matter that he collected his data this way versus that way? Like, why isn't it like partly true? Like why, like I guess those factors that it would immediately set off red flags in a more scientifically, like a very scientifically literate population might even make an average person, like, it wouldn't necessarily jump right out to me unless someone had pointed out those factors. So how would people who aren't even necessarily that interested in, there are not like science nerds, like, oh, science, that's cool, like science enthusiasts, I guess, like, how would you expect that to get across? Is there a way to convey that so they'd hear that and be like, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting, that makes me question that?
Yeah, so I actually think there are two really great questions in there. The first is concerns whether or not we should be holding the general public like responsible for kind of the minutia that go into like properly conducted science. And I would say that should not be the general public's job. Like within the field of science, within the insular field of science, we supposedly have very rigorous standards for publication, and anything like that should not be something that's even the worry of someone who's reading the paper unless they're reviewing it for like acceptance to a journal. Hopefully everything that is being published out there is quality enough that that should not be a serious concern. But with that being said, I do take everything I read with a grain of salt, and I make sure that at least the stark facts should be presented well and make sense. The second question in there, I think, is how can we, I guess, like keep people interested in the scientific process? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Kind of. I guess like if I was hearing it, like I might say like, why do I care if it was or wasn't in this journal? Like maybe he found something important, or I might say, that sounds like a lot of details, and I don't get why. I don't know if we can necessarily control like the source, but I'm wondering if there's a way to, without educating somebody in all the methodology, to be able to share that to an extent to someone who might be interested, but just.
Yeah, so I think I would never advocate, for example, for like us to just like distribute primary research papers to people and just be like, hey, like you got this, like I'm giving you all the information now and you can just run with it. I think that's absolutely the wrong way to go about this. I think it's our duty as scientists to recognize that the way that we communicate with each other as scientists is not going to be the correct way that we communicate with the general public. And like by no means am I saying that one version of the story needs to be dumbed down, but like recognizing and respecting that your audience is not going to necessarily have the same training background. Like every scientific article that I write, I will often remake a figure because it just doesn't make any sense to include all the minutia that is going to go into like a very rigorous scientific publication. If I read it and I believe it to be true, I'll remake it in a way that will really just get to the punchlines of what I'm trying to explain. And often when I compare and contrast a presentation for research scientists versus a presentation for the general public, I'll kind of tell them that we invert it. So when we talk to scientists, we often say like, here's all the background, here's all the results we got, and this is kind of what we concluded from it, and like you should believe me because by the end of this I've shown you enough data to convince you. I really flip that on its head when we're talking to the general public, because when we present information, we want to make sure we're only presenting information we're fairly confident in. So I'm comfortable putting the punchline first and saying, here's kind of what you should know. This is more about it as you go further down the article. And so I think it is still important to tune people in to how science works and the fact that science is not about like making broad generalizations and then sticking with those permanently. But I think it is worth recognizing that the general public is not going to respond to the same way to science that other scientists are. Did that kind of answer your question? Did that help at all?
That was really good. I guess it's more just like the cranks are always going to find a way to get their message out. So whether you want to control it or not, like people are going to hear it and go, oh, should I be worried?
Yeah. I think that's very fair.
Any additional questions? Newsfeed Cafe, perhaps? All right. Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Katie, for the talk. Let's give her a round of applause, please. And thank you all for coming out to Cafe Sci Boston. Again, this is a monthly series that we host here at the Boston Public Library in the WGBH studio. And we're really, again, thankful for the Newsfeed Cafe for providing refreshments throughout the duration of this talk. And thank you all for coming out here. Did you have any last announcements that you wanted to make about anything? Or?
I am going to really quickly plug my organization again. So we left flyers for you, very special presents for every person in the audience. So as Science in the News, we do many, many things in our attempt to better communicate with the general public. So we host free lecture series. Our first lecture of our fall series is beginning tomorrow evening at Harvard Medical School. We also do actually a very similar Science Cafe event to this one, though nowhere near as fancy as this, at Aeronaut Brewery, as well as at the Burn in Davis Square, where we bring local faculty in to give a very brief talk, then Q&A, and then they and their lab members will actually sit with you in the audience, drink beer, and just shoot the poop. And we also have a podcast if you want to tune into that, and our website, sitinboston.com, is full of articles that, at least to the extent of my knowledge, fairly and accurately represent science. But I really appreciate your attention. Thank you guys so much for having me, and thank you for your excellent questions.
Great, thank you so much. All right, have a good night, everyone.